She won't last the winter anyway. By spring, we'll have the whole ranch to ourselves. That was the first thing I heard when I came down the stairs. My daughter didn't bother lowering her voice. Neither did her husband. I stood at the bottom step, still wearing the black dress I'd put on 4 days ago for my husband's funeral, still holding the handkerchief I'd used to wipe my eyes at the graveside, and I listened to them carve up everything my husband and I had built together over 41 years the way you'd carve a turkey at Thanksgiving. Efficiently, without sentiment, without looking up, the ranch house smelled like cut flowers going soft, and the casserole's neighbors had dropped off. Outside, the Texas sky was the kind of pale gray it gets in November, low and heavy, like it was pressing down on purpose. My son-in-law was standing in the middle of the living room with a yellow legal pad, writing things down. The recliner, the gun cabinet, the oil painting of the Guadalupe River that my husband's mother left us when she passed. He was circling items the way a man circles properties at an auction, calm and methodical, like he'd been planning this long before the funeral. My daughter walked in from the kitchen with 2 mugs of coffee, one for her, one for him, and said, without looking at me, "We were thinking you'd be more comfortable in the guest room over the garage. Give you some privacy." She handed her husband the mug. "The main bedroom has better light, and we'll need the space for when the kids visit." I nodded. I didn't argue. I turned and walked back up the stairs. In my own bedroom, my bedroom, the one with the window that looked out over the pecan grove my husband planted the year our youngest was born, I sat on the edge of the bed and pressed my hand flat against the quilt. I'd sewn it myself. 22 years ago. Every square cut from something that had a story. A piece of my husband's first good shirt. A scrap from the curtains in the kitchen of our first house. A strip of blue gingham from the dress I was wearing the day we signed the deed to this land. I reached under the mattress and felt the edge of the envelope I'd placed there 6 months ago, when my husband first got the diagnosis, and we sat together at the kitchen table and talked about everything we'd never said out loud. The envelope was still there. I pressed my fingertips against it once, then pulled my hand back. Not yet. Downstairs, I could hear my son-in-law on the phone. "We're talking about 430 acres, he said. "Prime hill country. The mineral rights alone, yeah." "Yeah, I know. We'll list it by March." I sat very still and listened to him sell land that wasn't his. They put me in the room over the garage that same evening. It wasn't cruel, exactly. There was a bed, a small lamp, a bathroom with a shower head that sputtered. My daughter brought up a folded blanket and set it on the chair without making eye contact. "There's soup on the stove if you're hungry," she said, and then she was gone before I could answer. I heard her laughing with her husband in the hallway below me. Something about tile samples. They were already redesigning the kitchen. I didn't go down for soup. I sat in the chair by the small window and watched the pecan grove go dark. My granddaughter came by around 9, the older one, Kelsey. She was 23 and had her father's confident jaw and her mother's talent for looking at you without really seeing you. She leaned against the doorframe and said, "Grandma, you should really think about assisted living. Mom found a nice place in Kerrville. They have a garden and everything." She smiled the way people smile when they've already made the decision. "You can't stay here forever." "I know," I said. "It'd be easier. For everyone." She shrugged and disappeared. "For everyone." I turned that phrase over in my mind the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling its weight. Easier for everyone. I had spent 41 years on this land. I had raised 2 children in that house below me. I had helped birth calves in February mud and driven tractors in August heat, and sat with my husband through 4 droughts, 2 floods, and 1 lawsuit that nearly took everything. I had been the person who read every contract, every lease agreement, every mineral rights clause, because my husband was brilliant with land and livestock and entirely lost with paperwork. But I was a burden now, a detail to be managed, a guest room over the garage. I understood why my daughter thought this. I had let her think it. I had spent so many years being quiet, being useful without being visible, that she'd simply never learned to look. That was the truth I had to sit with. Not anger, not yet, just truth. I thought about the first time I understood what this land was really worth. It was 1,987. Before my daughter was born, when my husband came home from a meeting with a landman from a Houston oil company. "They want to lease the mineral rights," he told me. I sat at that same kitchen table with the lease agreement spread in front of me for 2 hours while he was out checking the fence line. I had spent 12 years working as a title examiner before we married. I knew what to look for, and what I found in that contract would have cost us everything: a perpetual royalty cap buried in Clause 11 that would have locked us into a rate that wouldn't survive inflation past the first decade. I rewrote the clause by hand. I typed it clean on the typewriter. I told my husband, cross out 11 and replace it with this. Don't explain. Just don't sign until they accept it. He did. They accepted it without question. He never asked how I knew. He just smiled and said, "You're something else, Miriam." And I put the typewriter away and started dinner. That clause, the one I rewrote in 1987, was the reason this ranch had generated royalty income for 37 years. The reason my husband had been able to weather every downturn without selling off parcels. The reason the mineral rights my son-in-law was already discussing over the phone were worth what they were worth. He didn't know that. My daughter didn't know that. They knew what they'd always been shown: a woman in an apron, a woman with a garden, a woman who made good pie crust and didn't talk much about business. The second night, I woke to the sound of voices below the window. My son-in-law was out near the truck with a man I didn't recognize, someone with a clipboard and a measuring wheel. They were walking the fence line with flashlights. I watched from the window until they came back around to the truck, and then I heard my son-in-law say, "She has no idea what any of this is worth." "Never did." The man laughed. I went back to the chair. I didn't sleep again. On the third morning, I put on my coat and drove myself into town. Not to the diner, not to the pharmacy. To the office of Wallace Pruitt, who had been my family's attorney for 28 years and who had drawn up the original deed to this property, and who was one of perhaps 4 people in Gillespie County who knew my full name was not just Miriam Calloway, but Miriam Jean Calloway Nayholt, and that before I married Robert Calloway, I had spent a decade at a title company in San Antonio, where I'd handled more mineral rights transactions than most petroleum attorneys saw in a career. Wallace was 71 and still wore bow ties. He stood when I came in. He didn't ask how I was holding up. He just said, "Sit down, Miriam. I've been expecting you." I set my purse on the chair beside me and opened it. I took out the envelope. Inside was a single document, 4 pages, stapled in the upper left corner. It was a copy of a trust agreement, signed by my husband and co-signed by me, dated March 2009. At the top, in clean type, it read, "Calloway Family Land Trust Co-Trustees, Robert Allen Calloway and Miriam Jean Calloway. Not beneficiaries, not signatories, co-trustees with equal controlling interest." Wallace read it through without speaking. Then he looked up. "They haven't seen this." "No," I said. "They think the ranch passes through the will." "It doesn't," I said. "The trust supersedes the will for all real property. Robert and I set it up specifically so the land couldn't be sold or transferred without both trustees' consent. After his passing, sole control transfers to the surviving trustee." I folded my hands in my lap. "That's me." Wallace set the document down carefully. "Miriam," he said, "do you understand what that means for the mineral rights conversation?" "Yes," I said. "It means my son-in-law's phone calls were premature." There was a long pause. Outside Wallace's window, Main Street looked the same as it always had, sleepy and sun-faded and quietly permanent. He leaned back in his chair. "There's more," I said. I reached into the envelope again and took out a second set of papers. These were older, the edges soft with handling. A photocopy of the original mineral rights lease from 1987, with the revised Clause 11 in my handwriting, initialed MJC in the margin. And beneath that, a notarized letter from the oil company's successor filed 18 months ago, when they'd renewed the lease, acknowledging the original clause and the identity of the party who had negotiated it. My name was on that letter, not Robert's, mine. I had never told my husband I'd sent that letter. He was sick by then, and there were things I was quietly beginning to put in order. I had learned, over a lifetime of being the person in the background, that paperwork has a memory even when people don't. Wallace read through everything slowly. When he finished, he set the papers down and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know, I have to ask you something." "Why did I wait?" I said. Yes. I looked out the window. This was the question I had asked myself on every drive into town, every morning in that room over the garage, every night, listening to my son-in-law walk the fence line with a stranger. Why had I waited? Why had I stood at the bottom of those stairs in my black dress and said nothing while they divided my life into categories on a yellow legal pad? Because I wanted to know who they really were, I said finally. Robert protected them from seeing it. Kept things smooth, kept the peace. I thought maybe I had misjudged. I paused. I had not misjudged. Wallace nodded slowly. He understood. He'd known us a long time. Also, I said, and I allowed myself one small, quiet thing that wasn't grief. I wanted them to be comfortable. You can't be surprised by something you were relaxed for. He smiled at that. Just barely. We spent 2 hours in his office. When I drove back to the ranch, I went in through the kitchen door and made myself a cup of tea and sat at the table where I had spent 41 years. My daughter came in around noon and said the title company was sending someone out on Friday. I told her that sounded fine. She looked at me the way she'd been looking at me all week, like a problem that was close to solving itself, and went back to whatever she was doing. I drank my tea. The will reading was scheduled for the following Thursday at Wallace's office, 10 in the morning. My daughter wore a cream blazer. My son-in-law wore a jacket I'd never seen before, the kind you buy when you want to look like someone who owns things. My granddaughter Kelsey brought a notepad. My grandson had driven down from Austin and was on his phone in the parking lot until 2 minutes after we were supposed to start. They arranged themselves around the conference table like people who had already decided how a meeting would go. My son-in-law sat at the far end with his elbows forward, close to the table, the posture of a man ready to receive something. My daughter had a pen uncapped and ready. Kelsey had her notepad open to a fresh page. I sat at the near end, in the chair closest to the door. I'd brought my own cup of coffee. No one offered. Wallace read through the standard portions first. The personal effects, the accounts, the vehicles. My husband had left his tools to a neighboring rancher he'd known for 30 years, his hunting rifles to his brother in Abilene, his watch a Bulova he'd worn every day since our wedding to me. My son-in-law shifted in his chair. They were waiting for the land. Wallace looked up from the document. He removed his reading glasses and set them on the table. This was unusual. Everyone noticed. Before we proceed to the real property, he said, "There's a matter Robert wanted addressed in person." He reached to his left and pressed the button on a small recorder. My husband's voice came out of that machine and filled the room the way his voice used to fill the kitchen when he came home at the end of a long day, unhurried, certain of itself, belonging there. "I want to say something about this land," he said, "about how it survived, because the story that got told wasn't the whole story, and I should have corrected it a long time ago." My son-in-law glanced at my daughter. She looked at Wallace. Neither of them looked at me. In 1987, my husband's voice continued, "A company came to us with a mineral rights lease. I almost signed it. The clause that would have gutted us was in there, plain as day, and I did not see it. Miriam saw it. Miriam rewrote it. Miriam is the reason this land has paid out what it's paid out for nearly 4 decades. A pause. The kind my husband always left before he said something he meant. I told people I had good instincts about contracts. That wasn't true. I had a wife who knew things I didn't, and who never once made me feel small for not knowing. The room had gone very quiet. Outside, a truck passed on the street. I could hear Kelsey's pen set down on her notepad. "The second thing," the recording continued, "is the trust. Miriam and I put it in place in 2009. She didn't ask me to. She sat me down one evening and explained what would happen to the land if we didn't protect it properly. I signed what she put in front of me because I trusted her completely and because she was right." Another pause. "She has always been right. I was just the one who got to stand in the sun." My daughter made a small sound. Not a word, just a sound. "The ranch, the mineral rights, the acreage, all of it is governed by the trust. Miriam is the surviving co-trustee. That means the decisions are hers. They have always been, in every way that matters, hers." The recording crackled slightly. "I am sorry it took me this long to say that, where people could hear it. I love you, Miriam. You built this, every last acre of it." Wallace reached over and clicked the recorder off. The silence afterward was the particular kind that happens when a room full of people realizes they misread a situation so completely that there is nothing useful to say. My son-in-law was the first to move. He sat back in his chair, slowly, like a man deflating. My daughter's pen was still in her hand, but she wasn't writing anything. Kelsey was staring at the table. My grandson cleared his throat. He was young enough that he hadn't fully understood what any of it meant, practically speaking. And so he said, "So Grandma owns everything?" "Your grandmother controls all real property assets held in the Calloway Family Land Trust," Wallace said. "The decision to sell, lease, develop, or maintain any portion of the ranch rests entirely with her." My son-in-law looked at me then. The first time all week he'd looked at me directly. "Miriam," he started. "There's one more thing," Wallace said. He opened a second folder. "Robert also asked that I present this." He slid a document across the table. It was a printout of royalty payments, 37 years of them, issued under the revised lease, the one I had rewritten by hand in 1987. The cumulative total was at the bottom of the last page. I didn't read it out loud. I didn't need to. I watched my son-in-law's eyes travel down the column of numbers. "Those funds were deposited into a separate account held in Miriam's name alone," Wallace said. "Robert's instructions were that the account remain entirely at her discretion." My daughter looked at me. There was something in her face I hadn't seen all week. Not remorse, not yet something more like the moment before remorse, when you realize the shape of what you've done, but haven't yet let yourself feel it. "I didn't know," she said. Her voice was different, quieter. "I know you didn't," I said. "You never told us." "No," I said. "I didn't." I folded my hands on the table. "You never asked what I did before I married your father. You never asked what I understood about this land. You asked me if I wanted soup and told me the guest room had good light." I kept my voice even. This wasn't anger. I had moved past anger somewhere around the third morning in that room over the garage. "I am not someone who needed you to know, but I am also not someone who will let this land be sold out from under me because it was easier to assume I didn't matter." My son-in-law was quiet. He was the kind of man who filled silence habitually, reflexively, and watching him have nothing to put in it was something I would remember for a long time. My grandson and I gave him credit for this, said, "What are you going to do with it, Grandma, the ranch?" "Keep it," I said. "For now." I looked at the pecan grove through Wallace's window, which faced east, the same direction my bedroom window faced. The trees need pruning, the east fence needs reposting, and someone let the mineral rights conversation get far ahead of itself, so I'll be renegotiating the next renewal personally. Wallace pressed his lips together in a way that meant he was pleased. My daughter asked if we could talk. I said yes, but not today. She nodded. She looked, for the first time, like a daughter rather than an administrator. I didn't know yet what we would be to each other going forward. That was true. I would have to find out. We left the office in stages. My grandson held the door. My son-in-law walked to his truck without speaking. Kelsey stopped beside me on the sidewalk and said, simply, "I'm sorry, Grandma." And I patted her arm once and said, "I know, sweetheart," because she was 23 and had been raised to follow her parents' lead, and that was a separate conversation for a separate day. I drove back to the ranch alone. When I got there, I went straight to the bedroom. My bedroom. I opened the window and let the November air in, cold and cedar-smelling, the particular scent of hill country in late fall that I had breathed for 41 years and planned to breathe for whatever years I had left. I sat in the chair by the window and watched the light change on the pecan grove. I thought about my husband's voice coming out of that small recorder in Wallace's office, unhurried, certain of itself. I thought about how long I had waited to hear him say those things in a room where it counted. He had known. He had always known. He was just, as he said, the one who got to stand in the sun. And I had let him, because that was the bargain we'd made in a time and a world that expected women to make that bargain. And because I had loved him without condition, and because if I was entirely honest, there had been a quieter satisfaction in knowing what I knew, in holding the thing that held everything else up, even if no one else could see it. But I was done being invisible. That chapter had closed in the lawyer's office with a recorder and a row of numbers on a printed page. I went downstairs and made dinner. Not for anyone else, they had all gone. Just for myself. I made the soup I liked, with white beans and rosemary from the pot by the back step, and I ate it at the kitchen table with the window open, listening to the ranch settle into evening the way it always had, the way I intended it to keep doing. Afterward, I took the original lease document, the one with my handwriting in the margin, my initials in blue ink beside Clause 11, and I had it framed. Not for the wall yet. Just framed. I set it on the kitchen counter where I could see it while I washed my cup. The pecan trees needed attention, and the fence needed work, and there were at least 3 things wrong with the pump on the south well that my husband had been putting off for 2 years. This ranch was not a simple inheritance. It was a working piece of land that required a person who understood it. I understood it. I had always understood it. I went to bed early. I slept in my own room, in my own bed, under the quilt I had sewn from pieces of everything that had mattered. The night was cold and quiet and entirely mine. A month later, I hired a ranch manager, a woman in her 40s named Darlene, who had grown up on livestock land and knew fencing and water rights and exactly what questions to ask when a company called about mineral leases. I told her what I'd told no one else. I'd spent 12 years as a title examiner before I was a rancher's wife, and I had no intention of being the kind of landowner who got managed by the people managing her land. She looked at me steadily for a moment and then said, "Good. We got along well after that." My daughter called in December. She wanted to visit. I said yes, and I meant it, with conditions I stated plainly and without apology. She agreed to them. It was the first conversation we'd had in 30 years where I said what I thought and she listened without finishing my sentences. We were not repaired, but we were not broken in the same way we'd been broken in November. Repair takes longer than a month. I had time. My son-in-law sent a letter. I read it once and put it in the filing cabinet. Some things deserve a response and some things deserve a record. That one I filed under things to return to when I felt generous. In January, I had the measuring wheel man traced, the one who'd been walking my fence line at night with a clipboard. He worked for a land development company out of San Antonio. I sent his employer a letter brief, factual, with Wallace's firm copied noting that the preliminary survey had been conducted without the knowledge or consent of the controlling trustee of the Callaway Family Land Trust, and that any further contact should be directed through my attorney. I never heard from them again. Spring came. The pecans put out new growth along every branch. I had the east fence reposted. The well pump got fixed by a man from Fredericksburg who charged fairly and didn't talk down to me, and I recommended him to every neighbor I had. I started going to the county land records office on Thursday mornings, not for anything urgent, just to stay current. The clerk there, a young woman who kept her hair in a braid, recognized me after the second visit. "You're the Callaway widow," she said. And I told her I was, and she started pulling files without being asked because she could tell I knew what I was looking at. I liked her. I started bringing 2 cups of coffee from the place across the street. The framed document ended up on the wall, not in the office, in the kitchen. That wall, the one you face when you're standing at the stove. It's the first thing I see when I come downstairs in the morning. A photocopy of a lease clause in my handwriting, 40 years old, initialed in blue ink. My husband used to say that a good piece of land outlasts everything you build on it. He meant it as comfort. I think he was right, but I'd add something to it now. A good piece of land remembers everything that happened to save it, even if the people standing on it don't. This land knows. And now, finally, so does everyone else. If there's a woman in your life who works quietly, who understands things she's never been asked about, who holds up more than she's ever been credited for, tell her you see her. Don't wait for a will reading to say it in a room where it counts. And if you are that woman, keep your paperwork in order, because one day, when the room goes quiet and a recorder clicks on, you'll want your name to be exactly where it belongs.